When Trump and his spouse chose Saudi Arabia as their first official foreign destination, the logic behind the trip seemed to be quite simple and straightforward. That was a cold financial calculation. Saudi petrodollars in exchange for US weapons, resulting in the creation of jobs for thousands of Americans.
We're talking about over 40,000 jobs in the United States. You know, you're talking about 500,000 jobs.
That was 110 billion. You know, you're talking about over 1 million jobs.
I don't want to lose 1 million jobs. I don't want to lose $110 billion in terms of investment, but it's really 450 billion if you include other than military.
Later, when Trump received one of the Saudi kingdom's highest honors by Salman, the king described bilateral relations as tied by shared interests and military cooperation. Trump also danced with the same tune, describing the relations as strategic. That was the same person as the one who skillfully used the ties as a weakness of his rival during the presidential election campaigns.
These are people that kill women and treat women horribly, and yet you take their money. So I'd like to ask you right now, why don't you give back the money?
He changed his attitude after the presidency, making a U-turn, taking a lenient approach towards the regime. For those familiar with Washington's political atmosphere, it was not so hard to understand the reasons behind Trump's mood swing towards the dictatorial regime. Like many decades ago, the Saudi lobby was at work, splashing money to every four corners of US politics. The gift-giving appears to be part of an influence effort by Saudis on both sides of the Atlantic. During the last few years, the Saudi regime has rapidly expanded its lobbying presence in the United States. It is actively hiring consultants and public relations experts with close ties to high-ranking officials and current and former ministers, senators, and congressional officials. From picking up the tab for travel expenses and events to paying the costs for accommodation, travel and meals, and hiring political figures in Saudi-affiliated companies, Saudis are keen on keeping the influential forces on their side. One could argue that the role of the Saudi regime in the 9/11 attacks remains at the center of controversies surrounding Saudi-US relations. But the Saudi lobby significantly used bribery maneuvers and blackmail tactics to get the regime off the hook. Saudis evidently resorted to all their leverages in the United States and particularly inside the Senate to suppress any evidence of the regime being involved in the attacks. As a part of the regime's campaign to prevent Jasta, US military veterans were sent on all expenses-paid trips to Washington on the Saudi government's dime to lobby against the act. The campaign failed.
15 years after that tragedy, we are still learning the fact. But there is mounting evidence that the Saudi government, or at least organizations and operatives within the Saudi government, aided and abetted one of the most massive crimes in the United States.
Shortly after revelations about the Saudi Crown Prince's direct role in the gruesome murder of Saudi dissident Khashoggi, many were expecting the fiasco would be an ending chapter in a long story of the United States and the dictatorial House of Saud's love affairs. Over a year on, and the story still consumes the world, and is in many ways more the start of a tale than the end of one. Trump sided with the 32-year-old Crown Prince in his struggle to sweep the fiasco under the carpet. In its simplest terms, it has now turned into the story of how the closest ally of the United States, with a frightening mix of delusion and calculation, is still lobbying, or in better terms, bribing US officials to remain committed to the toxic relations. The scandal also brought the prominent US think tanks and investors' links with the Saudi lobby under scrutiny. Washington's foreign policy community is a close network of think tanks, academic outfits, and other institutions that heavily influence the media and whose members frequently rotate into and out of government positions. The lobby's connections with the community are now heavily criticized by the public.
As to whether the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States is healthy, well, it's very healthy for Saudi Arabia because it's probably the only way that the Saudi monarchy can stay in power. Let's not forget this is a monarchy, no elections, a dictatorship effectively, and it's the only way they can stay in power, by keeping this relationship going with the US. From the American side, it's definitely not healthy.
Saudi Arabia has spent about $19 million on influence campaigns in the US since the beginning of 2017, and $9 million in 2018 alone. Despite that, the Saudi lobby seems to be on demise inside the United States. A new YouGov poll suggests that 42% of Americans regard the House of Saud as an unfriendly entity or an enemy. Inside the inner circle of power in Washington, a growing sense of threat from the Saudi regime could be felt easily. As the latest blow to the Saudi lobby's efforts, the United States Senate approved a war powers resolution that would end US involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. The resolution requires President Trump to cut off military support for the war in Yemen.
The Americans, they don't need the Saudi oil anymore. They have their own oil, and they have more options to go and buy their need of oil. This is an important issue when we want to talk about how the Americans are going to deal with the Saudis in the coming future.
The Senate passed a similar war powers resolution on Yemen late last year, but it died after the then Republican Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, refused to bring it to a vote. The Saudi lobby could not accomplish the job it successfully managed just months ago.
What is going to break the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States? I'll tell you what will break that relationship, and that is the truth of what really happened on the 9/11 attacks. Remember, most of the hijackers, alleged hijackers, were Saudi Arabian nationals, and Osama bin Laden is also, or was also, a Saudi national. So once those links between the Saudis and the 9/11 attacks are made public across the United States, will be a sensation. And I think you'll find that the relationship, the close relationship there now is between the US and the Saudis, will be over.